The Heroes of Telemark wasn't just a World War II thriller about stopping the Nazis from building an atomic bomb. It was Anthony Mann's last completed film, made after he'd been fired from Spartacus, after his epics had bankrupted producers, after Stephen Boyd sued him for $500,000, and before he died of a heart attack in Berlin while filming his next picture. Kirk Douglas and Richard Harris hated each other. The budget was £5,600,000. The snow was real, and 18 Norwegian civilians died in the actual mission the film quietly erased from its ending. Let's detonate it. Number 20. Stephen Boyd sued Mann for $500,000. The film was originally titled The Unknown Battle. Stephen Boyd and Elka Summer were attached as the leads. Boyd had just starred in Mann's The Fall of the Roman Empire the year prior. The production was announced, contracts were signed, then funding collapsed. Boyd sued Mann for $500,000. His lawsuit claimed he'd missed out on 4 lucrative roles and substantial income because Mann had signed him to a project without proper financial backing, then abandoned it. Boyd later said, "I'd made other commitments, so Kirk Douglas and Richard Harris made it under another title." The production was resurrected months later with Kirk Douglas in the lead and a new title, The Heroes of Telemark. By then, Boyd was gone. Anthony Perkins had also been announced as a potential star before departing. Cliff Robertson was mentioned as Richard Harris's potential co-star before Harris signed on. The film that reached theaters in November 1965 had gone through at least 3 different casting configurations and 1 lawsuit before a single frame was shot. The man who finally got the role had history with the director, and not the good kind. Number 19. Douglas owed Mann a film after Spartacus. Kirk Douglas and Anthony Mann had worked together on Spartacus in 1960. Briefly, Mann was the original director. Then Douglas, who was also the producer, fired him after a major creative disagreement. Stanley Kubrick replaced him. The sulfur mine sequence that opens the finished film is widely attributed to Mann's direction before his dismissal. In his memoir, Douglas acknowledged that he owed Mann a film after that debacle. When Mann called him unexpectedly in 1964 and asked him to star in The Heroes of Telemark, Douglas accepted. Not because he was passionate about Norwegian resistance fighters. Not because he was eager to work with Mann again. Because he felt professionally obligated to make things right. The 2 men reunited on a production that would become Mann's last completed picture. Their working relationship was functional. The personal warmth was not there. And the film they made together was not the commercial hit either of them needed. Douglas signed on out of obligation. His co-star signed on and immediately started drinking. Number 18. Harris and Douglas hated each other. Richard Harris was, by multiple documented accounts, quite the carouser in the 1960s. He had clashed with Marlon Brando. He had clashed with Charlton Heston. Kirk Douglas was a talented egotist whose need for control on set was legendary. Harris's need for chaos was equally legendary. Yet, they got along, famously. Defying every industry expectation, production accounts described the set as surprisingly warm. Harris reportedly still spent significant time drinking. Douglas, whose blue anorak made him immediately visible and recognizable in every scene, unlike the other saboteurs, carried himself like the star he was. But instead of clashing, Harris genuinely respected Douglas's relentless work ethic, and Douglas was deeply amused by Harris's wild antics. The tense dynamic between them on screen, 2 men forced to work together despite fundamental incompatibility, was entirely acting. It was a testament to their professionalism, masking an unexpected behind-the-scenes bromance. What they were working on was supposed to be historically accurate. It was not. Number 17. The real saboteur said it was fiction. Knut Haukelid, the actual Norwegian resistance fighter whose memoirs Skiss Against the Atom formed part of the film's source material, was alive during production. He visited the set, and he was blunt about what he saw. "I hear they are spending $5 million. So it's gotta be spectacular, and that means more fiction and less fact." He was correct. The film condenses multiple separate sabotage operations, Operations Grouse, Freshman, and Gunnerside, into a single sustained narrative. The real commandos had already left the area when the bomb exploded. The film shows them present. The film also invents a romantic subplot involving Douglas's ex-wife that has no basis in the historical record. The real story was dramatic enough. 30 British commandos were killed, tortured, and executed by the Gestapo in the initial failed raid. The Norwegian team that succeeded operated in conditions so severe that their survival required skills the film only gestured toward. But survival skills don't sell tickets. Kirk Douglas in a blue anorak shooting Germans does. The blue anorak was not the only historical problem. Number 16. 18 civilians died in the real attack. The film's climax involves sabotaging a ferry, carrying drums of heavy water across a fjord. The ferry sinks in the deepest part of the lake. Mission accomplished. But the heroes don't just ski away without consequences. The real SF Hydro ferry sinking killed 14 Norwegian civilians and 4 Germans, men, women, and children who had nothing to do with heavy water production. They drowned because the ferry they were riding on was carrying cargo the Allies desperately needed destroyed. The film boldly makes it the central moral dilemma. Douglas and Harris's characters agonize over the civilian cost. The script weighs the crushing moral reality of what the saboteurs had to execute, knowing they would kill their own countrymen to complete the mission. While a 1948 Franco-Norwegian film called Kampen om Tungtvannet featured actual participants, the Heroes of Telemark actively leans into this dark complexity. The tragedy is cemented by the haunting final shot of a passenger's violin case floating amid the wreckage. The locations where those civilians died were used as filming locations. Number 15, they filmed on the actual sites. Anthony Mann insisted on location filming. The production shot in Vemork, Rjukan, Tinjo, and Gausta, the actual towns and regions in Telemark where the sabotage missions occurred. The Norsk hydro plant, the fjord where the ferry sank, the mountains the commandos crossed on skis. All real. Mann's preference for location work over studio sets was well documented. In a 1965 interview, he said, "The use of the location is essential. For the Heroes of Telemark, that philosophy meant shooting in sub-zero conditions on the same mountains where men had frozen to death 22 years earlier." The production also filmed in Oslo, and for the sequences involving the escape from Norway, they shot around Poole and Hamworthy in Dorset, England. The former Channel Islands ship TSS Roebuck played the role of the hijacked steamer. SF Ammonia was used to represent the train ferry SF Hydro in the final fjord scenes. The authenticity Mann achieved came at significant cost, both financial and physical. The physical cost was paid in cold that made breathing visible on camera. Number 14. The cold was genuinely dangerous. The Norwegian locations in winter were not just uncomfortable. Multiple accounts describe the conditions as genuinely hazardous. Cast and crew worked in snow-covered mountains with minimal heating equipment. The wind chill was severe enough that extended exposure risked frostbite and hypothermia. Martin Scorsese, whose visual approach is the polar opposite of Mann's, praised the director's ability to create deceptively simple mise-en-scène that delivers maximum impact with minimal fuss. In The Heroes of Telemark, that simplicity meant pointing cameras at real snow, real mountains, and real humans struggling through real cold. The visual result is unforgettable. The scenes of commandos trudging through snowdrifts with wind howling in the background are enough to make viewers reach for warm beverages regardless of the season. But those images were not created through production design. They were captured through endurance. The endurance extended to the action sequences. Number 13. The sky chase predated Bond by 4 years. The film includes an extended ski chase sequence that is one of its visual highlights. Kirk Douglas and Richard Harris, or more accurately, their stunt doubles and Olympic-level ski consultants racing down mountainsides pursued by German soldiers. The sequence predates the famous ski chase in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, 1969, by 4 years. It also predates Jean-Claude Killy's Snow Job, 1972. Mann hired former Norwegian underground soldiers as advisors and brought in an Olympic ski coach to choreograph the sequences. The result is thrilling, even if it stretches credibility to watch a physics professor transform into an action hero without visible hesitation or learning curve. Kirk Douglas's character goes from philandering academic to gun-carrying commando, who kills without remorse in what feels like a single-scene transition. That transformation was one of the film's narrative weaknesses, but the skiing was spectacular. The man directing that skiing had made some of the greatest westerns ever filmed. Number 12. Mann was a western master who lost his way. Anthony Mann directed Winchester 73, Bend of the River, The Naked Spur, The Man from Laramie, and Man of the West, some of the finest psychological westerns ever made, all starring either James Stewart or Gary Cooper. French critics Jacques Rivet and André Bazin wrote glowingly of his work. Martin Scorsese praised his visual instincts. By the mid-1960s, Mann had moved into large-scale epics. El Cid, 1961, was magnificent. The Fall of the Roman Empire, 1964, was pictorially resplendent but commercially catastrophic. It bankrupted producer Samuel Bronston with its $18,400,000 budget and $1,900,000 gross. The Heroes of Telemark was supposed to be a return to tighter, more focused filmmaking. Instead, it became another example of Mann struggling to find his footing in an era of international co-production where spectacle often overwhelmed character. Critics who remembered his westerns noted that those films were famous for emphasizing character over action. The Heroes of Telemark reversed that priority. The action dwarfs the characters. The landscape is spectacular, but the people inhabiting it feel one-dimensional in ways Mann's earlier anti-heroes never did. Part of that may have been the production company nobody can identify. Number 11. Nobody knows who produced it. The film is credited to Benton Film Productions. That company appears in connection with this film and nothing else. There is no other record of Benton Film Productions existing before or after the Heroes of Telemark. But the mystery of the financing is entirely a myth. Was there Hollywood money involved? Yes, but Benton itself wasn't a shadowy cabal. It was simply a legal shell company created specifically for this co-production. The name Benton is just a portmanteau of the two lead creatives who drove the project, producer Benjamin Fiss and director Anthony "Tony" Mann. Ben plus ton equals Benton. So Benton Film Productions was never a ghost. The company that financed one of the bigger budget World War II films of the mid-1960s vanished because it was designed to exist for exactly one movie. What remains is the film itself, and a music score that sounds suspiciously familiar. Number 10. The score was recycled from Quay. Malcolm Arnold composed the music for the Heroes of Telemark. Arnold had won an Academy Award for his score for The Bridge on the River Kwai, 1957. Both films were distributed by Columbia Pictures. Multiple viewers and critics have noted that the action-themed music in Telemark sounds remarkably similar, possibly identical in places, to cues from Arnold's Kwai score. The suggestion is that Columbia, either to save money or time, repurposed existing Arnold cues rather than commissioning entirely new compositions. Arnold's music for Trapeze and The Roots of Heaven also shared sonic similarities. But the Kwai connection is particularly notable given that both films were World War II dramas distributed by the same studio. Was Columbia on an economy drive in 1965? Did they ask their composer to essentially remix his own Academy Award-winning work? The film has no extras on its Blu-ray release, so no commentary or production notes address this directly, but the resemblance is difficult to ignore once noticed. The economy drive, if real, did not extend to the actual production. Number 9. Rank spent £1 million on the film. In February 1964, Rank announced it would make 8 films at a cost of £4,500,000. The Heroes of Telemark was one of them. Rank's stake in this particular film was reportedly £1 million, a substantial investment in an era when most British films cost far less. This was Rank's attempt to compete in the big-budget international market. They had an American star, Douglas, an American director, Mann, and an American co-financier, Columbia. The goal was to create a Guns of Navarone-style blockbuster that would dominate the United Kingdom box office and perform well internationally. The film did well in Britain. It was top 13 at the United Kingdom box office and top 5 in France, but it was not the massive hit Rank hoped for. The resulting movie, as film historians have noted, gives off the aura of a script that has been changed and rechanged, entertaining with memorable moments, but never quite cohering into the epic it was designed to be. Part of the problem was the title. Number 8. The title baffled audiences in 1965. When the film was released, audiences who didn't know Norwegian geography were genuinely confused by the title. Telemark is a region. The heroes are from that region. But if you're not familiar with Norway's administrative divisions, the Heroes of Telemark reads as awkwardly as the Heroes of Yorkshire or the Heroes of Bavaria. The original title, The Unknown Battle, was more accessible but less distinctive. The final title prioritized geographic specificity over marketing clarity. Reviewers noted the issue. The title promised something epic and specific, but delivered something that required prior knowledge to parse. For British audiences familiar with the Telemark story from wartime coverage, it worked. For American audiences in 1965, it was an obstacle. The obstacle did not prevent the film from becoming a minor classic in one specific way. Number 7. It became a Saturday matinee staple. The Heroes of Telemark was not a major theatrical success, but it found a second life on television. For decades, it played regularly on British television as a Saturday matinee feature, the kind of film programmers would schedule for weekend afternoon audiences looking for solid, unpretentious action-adventure entertainment. That longevity suggests the film delivered exactly what it promised. Kirk Douglas and Richard Harris on skis, blowing up Nazis in spectacular snowy landscapes. It was not profound. It was not morally complex. But it was comprehensively absorbing. Ramirez later made a documentary called The Real Heroes of Telemark, 2003, that told the story with more attention to survival skills and historical accuracy. That documentary featured interviews with actual veterans of the mission, now in their 80s, and included scenes from the 1948 Norwegian film that featured the real participants. But for casual viewers, The Heroes of Telemark remained the accessible version, the one with movie stars and a big budget and explosions. One of those explosions was filmed with a technique that predated modern safety standards. Number 6. They used real explosives on location. When the film required explosions, Mann did not rely on miniatures or optical effects, but the production could not use real high explosives inside the actual Norsk Hydro plant. Instead, the massive interior of the factory was painstakingly recreated as a giant set at Pinewood Studios in England. The special effects team included John Fulton, Ron Ballinger, Sidney Pearson, and Bill Warrington. Their work involved precision engineering to ensure that explosive sequences within the sound stages would produce a devastating result without killing anyone. The margin for error was intensely narrow. This commitment to practical effects meant that what you see on screen actually happened. The massive set exploded, the fire burned, the danger was very real. That authenticity is why the action sequences still hold up. The cinematographer capturing that stress was one of the best in the business. Number 5, Robert Krasker shot it in Panavision. Robert Krasker, Academy Award-winning cinematographer for The Third Man, shot the Heroes of Telemark in Panavision. The 2.3, 5:1 widescreen format was essential for capturing the scope of the Norwegian landscapes. Some territories reportedly blew the film up from 35mm to 70mm for roadshow presentations, though it was shot and released primarily in 35mm. Krasker's work on the film is technically accomplished, but has been described by some critics as unattractively photographed. This is a minority view. The majority assessment is that the snowy vistas are spectacular and that Krasker made excellent use of the location work. One technical detail. Norwegian cinematographer Egil Stoyland, who served as a camera operator, managed some stunning shots while holding the camera between his legs, a technique Mann encouraged for achieving unusual angles and perspectives. The visual result is a film that, whatever its narrative shortcomings, looks like a million-pound production. Which it was. But all that money could not solve one fundamental problem. Number 4. Kirk Douglas was miscast as a physicist. Kirk Douglas plays Dr. Rolf Petterson, a Norwegian physics professor. The film introduces him in a darkroom, stealing an illicit fumble with an employee. He is charming, philandering, academically accomplished, and physically imposing. He is also Kirk Douglas in a blue anorak. At no point does the film successfully convince the audience that this man is a scientist first and an action hero second. His transformation from university professor to commando is instantaneous and complete. He picks up a gun and starts killing Germans with the ease of a man who has been doing it his entire life. This was a casting problem. Douglas was a massive star whose presence guaranteed international distribution, but his star persona, muscular, dynamic, charismatic, overwhelmed the character. Reviewers noted that he was irritating in the early scenes, but that his star presence provided narrative drive. Richard Harris, playing the resistance fighter, was relatively subdued. The film became a Kirk Douglas vehicle, and Douglas was not playing a professor, he was playing Kirk Douglas. The miscasting was structural. The script problems were worse. Number 3. The script was rewritten repeatedly. Ivan Moffat, Tender is the Night, and Ben Barsman, The Blue Max, are credited with the screenplay. But production accounts describe a script that had been changed and rechanged throughout development and shooting. The aura of multiple revisions is visible in the finished film. Characters are introduced and abandoned. Subplots begin and peter out. The romantic triangle involving Douglas, Harris, and Ulla Jacobson as Anna feels tacked on rather than organic. The pacing lurches between extended action sequences and talky planning scenes. Critics who reviewed the film noted that it would have benefited from a sharper storyline and more penetrating dialogue. Mann's visual flair was on full display, but the narrative engine underneath was sputtering. This was not entirely Mann's fault. The film had gone through multiple casting configurations, a title change, and a lawsuit before shooting began. The script was assembled under pressure, and it shows. That pressure extended all the way to the final cut. Number 2. Mann's epic instincts overwhelmed the story. Anthony Mann had made El Cid and The Fall of the Roman Empire 3-hour epics with casts of thousands. The Heroes of Telemark runs 131 minutes. Some sources say 124. For a men-on-a-mission thriller, that is long. The pacing reflects Mann's epic training. He lingers on landscapes. He builds sequences with patience rather than urgency. The result is a film that looks spectacular, but feels, in the words of one critic, like it pretends it's going somewhere and isn't. Comparisons to The Guns of Navarone, 1961, were inevitable. Navarone was tighter, faster, more propulsive. Telemark was stately. Mann's instinct was to give every scene room to breathe. For a Western or an epic, that worked. For a World War II sabotage thriller, it created drag. The film is still entertaining, it is still absorbing, but it is not urgent. And urgency was what the material required. Mann would never get the chance to correct those instincts. Number 1. This was Mann's last completed film. The Heroes of Telemark opened in London in November 1965. 2 years later, Anthony Mann was in Berlin, Germany, directing the spy thriller A Dandy in Aspic. On April 29, 1967, he died of a heart attack in his hotel room. He was 60 years old. He had been filming for 2 weeks. Lawrence Harvey, the film's star, completed the picture without credit. A Dandy in Aspic was released in 1968. It is a strange, strained film. Critics have noted it feels like Mann was trying to become a hip stylist in the mold of Richard Lester and could not quite make the transition. The Heroes of Telemark, for all its flaws, was the last film Mann finished with his vision intact. It was not the masterpiece he deserved to go out on, but it was respectable. It showcased his gifts. And it left behind images, snow-covered commandos silhouetted against white mountains that remain indelible. Martin Scorsese, speaking years later, said of Mann, "The guy knew what he was doing." He did, right up until the end. Bonus fact, some 70mm prints may have existed. The film was shot in 35mm Panavision, but some sources suggest that 70mm blow-up prints were struck for select roadshow presentations in certain territories. This was not uncommon in the mid-1960s. Prestigious releases would sometimes be shown in 70mm, even if they were shot in 35mm with mono sound rather than the 6-track magnetic audio typical of true 70mm productions. Sony's Blu-ray, released in 2119, presents the film in its original 2.35:1 aspect ratio, but includes no extras and no confirmation of whether 70mm prints actually existed. The visual quality on the Blu-ray is strong, suggesting the 35mm elements were well preserved. If 70mm prints were struck, they would have been for European markets, likely the United Kingdom and France, where the film performed best. American audiences, who were less familiar with the Telemark story, did not embrace the film with the same enthusiasm. The roadshow era was ending. Within a few years, 70mm would be reserved for true spectacles like 2001, A Space Odyssey and Lawrence of Arabia re-releases. The Heroes of Telemark may have been one of the last mid-tier productions to receive that treatment. The Heroes of Telemark made money, not a fortune, but enough. It played well in the United Kingdom and France. It found a long life on television. It introduced international audiences to one of the most daring sabotage missions of World War II, even if it simplified and dramatized the story beyond recognition. Kirk Douglas and Richard Harris never worked together again. Anthony Mann died 2 years after the film's release. Stephen Boyd's lawsuit was settled. The real Norwegian commandos grew old and watched multiple films and documentaries tell their story with varying degrees of accuracy. Ray Mears's 2003 documentary is the most faithful account. The 1948 Norwegian film is the most immediate, featuring actual participants. The Heroes of Telemark is the most accessible and the most Hollywood. It is not a masterpiece, but it is a monument to a specific kind of filmmaking that no longer exists. Big budget, location, shot, star-driven action-adventure made by a director whose instincts were shaped by westerns and film noir, trying to navigate an industry that was already moving past him. Mann's final completed film is a time capsule, and inside that capsule is a director who knew what he was doing even when the industry no longer knew what to do with him. If this changed how you see World War II films, or how you see what happens when a master's instincts outlive his moment, drop it in the comments. Share it with someone who thinks Guns of Navarone invented the genre. Subscribe, because we're in the archive every week, finding what the mythology buried. They didn't invent the mission film, they perfected it right before it stopped mattering.